The Shadows in Professor Jiang Joking's Cave. Another scholarly destruction of one of the internet's leading shadow casters, a man who is, like so many others, a New Age Christian, a media believer, a political prophet, and a professor of literature and history. Today, I will play the annoying commentator, as I often do, and focus on Professor Joking's 10th Civilization lecture, which he titled The Trial of Socrates and Plato's Allegory of the Cave. As his title suggests, he will not be presenting anything new. Simple regurgitation for people who don't want to read and think for themselves. That is his game. That's what professors do. Regarding Plato's allegory of the cave, to be clear, it portrays us, you and I, as subhuman cave dwellers who confuse the shadows on their walls, on our walls, with reality and truth. Thus, Plato politely or poetically called us idiots living in a world of illusions. I can't entirely disagree with that assessment, but Plato was himself a caster of illusions, and Professor Joking's classroom is nothing more than a digital cave in which he produces shadow shows. Let's take a close look at some of the shadows shared by Professor Joking. Hmm, this will be fun, as it always is.
Okay, so we are doing Socrates and Plato today. Um, Last class we did Greek theater. And remember I said that Aeschylus, Socrates, and Euripides, they really plot democracy. They see themselves as teachers who teach the Athenians how to practice democracy. We also said that there are three major benefits to democracy. The first major benefit is kings are bad. Okay?
It's a benefit of democracy. Kings are bad. This is highly inarticulate. Does this mean democracy makes kings bad, proves kings are bad, or that all people who believe in democracy believe kings are bad? What the F? I am at a loss. I'll leave that one for now.
Kings have hubris, and hubris creates all sorts of problems.
Yeah, and your neighbor doesn't have hubris. No egos, no arrogance around the common people. Nope.
Remember in the play Antigone by Sophocles, the king Creon sentences Antigone to death, even though it was unjust. That was because of hubris.
But it's a play, sir. It's a play. It's not evidence that kings are proud, hubristic. What does this? What is that? I'm at a loss again.
Second benefit of democracy is it is a gift from the gods that teaches citizens individual responsibility.
Well, not if democracy means representative democracy, because representatives break their promises, so voters can blame them instead of themselves. That's how the game works. You get to bear no responsibility through voting and electing.
Okay, so remember that in Aristia, Aeschylus told us that democracy is a gift from Athena in order to promote justice and truth in the world. And the third major benefit is democracy is really the best way to promote justice and truth.
Democracy is the best way to promote justice and truth. Isn't that what history has taught us also? Professor Joking, you are surely joking. Well, he's just regurgitating what he's read. We don't know what his opinion is. But judging from history, no, democracy does not promote justice and truth. Um, if you believe what happens in the Middle East, well, I believe Jews voted for their governments in Israel, and Palestinians voted for their government. And yeah, wonderful result. Americans do the same. Well, everyone's guilty of something via the governments they have elected. Should we continue after the good professor presented these 3 points of bowel crap concerning democracy? He will present Socrates' anti-democracy bowel crap, thus placing us firmly between two pillars of crap. Two bad options, what logicians call the false dichotomy fallacy. What is the good professor's stance? Does he stand between the two pillars or sit on one of them? Who knows? The following are the Socratic points against democracy presented without criticism by Professor Joking. 1. Democracy can't work because most people don't have reason, which is a polite way of saying people are stupid. Perhaps mostly true. But Plato and Joking are partly to blame, as is the education system and the media, as is the dominant, too busy, stressful, and toxic lifestyle we are living. These factors render us unable to think, especially not, especially about sensitive topics. And sensitive topics are the most important topics. Point number 2, Socrates would show the flaws in people's reasoning, thinking, through Socratic dialogue. Now we enjoy a little irony as I will, or already am, already began exposing the flaws in Professor Joking's presentation and in Socrates's. Bile crap. Number 3, Professor Joking asks his students to give him a statement that is fundamentally true so that he can demonstrate Socratic method. And a student says, the earth is a sphere. Well, in response, Professor Joking says, you can hold a ball in your hand, so you know it's a sphere, but can you hold the earth in your hand? No, good point, but really meaningless. The whole flat earth heliocentric argument, it's a little tiresome, perhaps just a giant distraction. Unless that's the whole point, to keep us distracted, then it's not meaningless. But the professor does not voice an opinion on these matters, and missed his chance to lose many of his followers by showing some support for the flat earth argument, which has its points. Let's let him speak for himself. I've done too much talking.
Because fundamentally, language does not capture the truth, okay?
Fundamentally, language does not capture the truth. I don't think that's in Plato. If language itself is mere shadows on the wall, why is the good professor bothering to speak? Why doesn't he hide in a cave somewhere. That would be nice. Um, does that make sense to anyone? Language cannot capture truth. Is this a deliberate attempt to make us stop expecting anything good from verbal communication and to stop trying to make language communicate powerful truths? Well, a quick survey of the social media world might convince us that yes, language is useless. So please don't spend too much time there. Does Professor Joking ever communicate powerful truths? Do we ever hear students say, no, that can't be true, it's too shocking? Or on the other hand, thank you for that truth, Professor. It will be very helpful. I can't say I've watched all his lectures, but my suspicion is that his students never say that. Um, his subscribers are infinitely patient, bedazzled and enchanted by his words, and his shallow knowledge, well, his shadows. Next, Professor Joking summarizes a silly parody of Socrates, um, titled The Clouds by Aristophanes. It portrays Socrates as a bad influence on society because his atheism persuades people to not fulfill promises they made by swearing in the name of Zeus, a god. Obviously, if you're an atheist, you don't believe in gods. Um, but that wouldn't be proof on its own that gods don't exist and that swearing on a god is null and void. Sadly, Professor Joking did not make an effort to convince us that atheism is more than just a belief system. Anyway, the whole story is very silly. Obviously, a better comedian would tell us that we don't owe our banks and mortgage lenders money because they didn't give us the money. Instead, they give us debt-based credit through the miracle of fractional reserve banking, which is more and more resembling zero reserve banking or zero cash lending and, well, pure fraud. Of course, Professor Joking did not mention this highly relevant point about the banks that help make this world go round and round in the toilet bowl of life. Let's move ahead to a place where the good professor discusses the allegory of the cave. Not sure what I'm supposed to say about it. 1955.
Famous metaphor. It's called Allegory of the Cave. And this is really the most famous allegory or metaphor or analogy in Western thought, okay, by far. Nothing comes second to this. So before I start the allegory of the cave, are there any questions so far about what I've discussed? Anything unclear? Anything you would like to question or doubt or argue with?
Well, you haven't taught your students to be questioners and arguers, so don't expect anything from them.
If I continue with the allegory of the cave. Okay? Clear so far? All right. So this is the allegory. Imagine a cave like on this into this cave. Okay? There are these prisoners who are chained to the floor, and they're chained so that they cannot move their necks. They can't move around. Okay? They can't move. The only thing they can do is stare at a wall in front of them. That's the only thing they can do. Okay?
All right. Yeah. No, that's not okay for people to be chained so that they can't even turn their heads and to be stuck in a cave. Nothing okay about that. All right. What a silly allegory. If a fire is behind the spectators and casting shadows of things controlled by the director of the fire, the masters of the world, that fire would also cast the shadows of the spectators onto the wall. So they should realize they are looking at shadows, illusions, not reality. So the allegory does not work so well. Um, More importantly, the truth is that joking students are in his cave, watching a fake professor present shallow knowledge of a book written by an imaginary man named Plato. The truth is that the professor's students, in class and online, are passive receivers of his words. They are mentally chained by their inability to think about the words they receive from him. And they are chained by their inability to recognize that joking is babbling, sharing useless, shallow, meaningless ideas that will not help anyone live a better life. Professor Joking's cave. Let's move ahead again to the 28th minute.
Source of everything. Okay? It's a source of all truth. It is the truth. It's called the form of the good.
The form of the good is the source of everything. And as he will argue, that's just God in disguise, or with a different name.
And emanating from the form of the good are concepts and ideals that structure the universe. And they are reason, beauty, and truth, and justice. Okay? And then there are others. Okay? But these are the main ones. Reason, truth, beauty, and justice. They emanate from the form of the good.
And structure the universe. Which is why, I suppose, the constellations, black holes, and radiation are forms of justice and goodness. My friends, this is not philosophy or metaphysics. This is infantile bowel crap.
Okay? And then emanating from these concepts are these forms that are perfect. Okay? So, for example, maybe the perfect horse, which represents beauty. Okay? Or the perfect woman, who represents justice and beauty as well. Okay? But this all.
Mm-hmm. What is the perfect woman and the perfect horse? Could we have some more concrete details? I'd be interested to know how such a horse would look and how such a woman would behave. But no details, none forthcoming from the professor.
All perfection. And from this higher world comes the lesser world, the reality we live in. So everything that we see here, everything that we are here, is only an imitation, a shadow of this world. Okay?
Wow. That's this world is only a shadow of the better world. That's a nice little fairy tale. Yes, now the physical world is the shadow of the spiritual world. That's topsy-turvy thinking. In reality, the spiritual world or imaginary world is always a shadow and a corruption of the physical world. All images, everything in the imagination is based on the real world.
Does that make sense? Mutation. So there are horses, but these horses are just copies of that perfect horse up there. Okay, so the major difference is in this world is eternal. It has always existed and it will always exist. It's eternal. Second is it is immutable. Immutable just means it will never change. Okay, and the reason why is it's perfect. Okay, so these are three distinct qualities of this higher world: eternal, immaculate, and perfect. And everything down here is basically the complete opposite. Okay, we will all die. We will all feel pain. But up there, no one feels any pain. No one dies. It's all perfect.
It's all perfect. Indeed. How he regurgitates these lovely fairy tales. Um, we all die, we all feel pain. That's the imperfect world, apparently. But that is the natural order. Plato and uh, religions that echo his philosophy, they all blaspheme nature. All living things die, and to disrespect that fact, to hate it, is to embitter yourself. And of course, to deny your mortality is an act of cowardice. And worse, belief in immortality is highly toxic. It can make you feel good, just as alcohol does, supposedly. But it blinds us to the truth of our mortality, which unconsciously causes believers to recklessly risk their lives and waste their lives on slavery and frivolity. Yeah, why not? You're going to heaven anyway. You're immortal anyway. That's in the back of your mind. Of course, believers could rightly counter that atheists are also guilty of um, wasting their lives on slavery and frivolity and recklessly risking their lives on dangerous pursuits. Well, that's true, because atheists are not mortalists, even though they don't believe in immortality, at least not in God. They don't meditate on their mortality and they don't respect death. Therefore, they continue living as if they believe they are immortal, as asleep as the believers they like to mock. Professor Joking's lecture on Plato is now fully dismantled and exposed by you know who. I hope you enjoyed that, but I'm not finished with Joking and Plato. This is the end of my dismantling of the professor's lecture about Platonism. I will now share with you one of my short written lectures about Plato. I think the contrast will be nice. Afterwards, let me know if it's more thought-provoking than Joking's lecture. Let me share from my book, Counterfeit Classics, a mental fitness course. All my books are mental fitness challenges, really. Ancient Greek, Roman, and medieval European civilizations never existed, and their alleged literature is weaponized ignorance. To understand evil, one must think like the devil. Well, let me skip ahead to the irrelevant passage about Plato. Plato, the philosopher. Lucifer, yes, that word is encoded in the word philosopher. Encrypted, maybe is a better word. I will read a couple pages under the heading, The Ideal Son of the Cannibals. One of Plato's leading superstitious ideas is this: the physical world is fiction, not real, or not as real as imagination. This idea is his theory of forms, or the theory of ideas. And it is also known as Platonic idealism, or more absurdly, as Platonic realism. It propounds that the physical world is not as real as mere shadows projected from the real world, which is abstract thought, or spiritual, or a world of pure imagination. Nietzsche and Professor Joking suspect this proves Plato is the origin of Christianity, because that ain't because they believe ancient Greeks wrote long, boring books for an illiterate public, which I don't believe. Plato's books are, well, Plato's collected works are long. The Republic, which the professor was responding or regurgitating, mm, might clock in at, I don't know, 150 pages. For whom did he write? At a time when literacy was extremely limited. Anyhow, uh, what Plato wrote isn't merely related to Christianity, it's related to all the major religions, which all universally denigrate the natural world, which we might use as evidence that the same anti-nature psychopaths created all the world's major religions. Additionally, Plato's anti-reality, anti-nature, and anti-sensory bias has many reincarnations in later philosophers, and it continues today as billions of people trade the natural world for the virtual, digital, or ideal world. Plato's anti-nature bias can be confirmed with a quick review of his statements about the sun in his The Republic. Here is its first statement. The plant, which is in the fullest vigor, also suffers least from winds or the heat of the sun. Here, the sun is portrayed as a cause of suffering or wilting for plants, as if the sun were not necessary for the life of every plant. Like all other authors of classic and sacred literature, Plato never spoke well of the real sun. The reason? They all encourage us to ignore and reject nature, because they know that the only way for us to escape from their slavery civilization is for us to serve and enhance nature, not to ruin and reject it. Civilization is fundamentally in conflict with nature. It requires clear-cutting forests, tilling the soil, mining minerals, creating new chemicals, building machines, enslaving humanity, and committing cannibalism. All anti-nature behaviors. The last action in the above list of anti-nature actions is cannibalism, which isn't commonly discussed. Who knows why? However, Plato was not too shy to write about it. And these authors never can resist the chance to write about cannibalism. Go figure. Scholars believe Plato condemned cannibalism, but did he? I'm suspicious. In the Republic, Plato wrote that in our dreams, when reason is asleep, all people have latent, quote, terrible, wild, and lawless, unquote, desires, which can include the desire, quote, to eat anything, unquote. Cannibalism is implied. Elsewhere, Socrates uses the myth of Lacan. Who knows how to pronounce that? I'm not Greek. Who was turned into a wolf after serving the flesh of his son Nicodemus to the gods. To argue that a wolf-like leader devours his people through unjust actions. false accusations and murders. So this man, Lycon, this unlikable Lycon, um, served the flesh of his son Nicodemus to the gods to argue or to make the point that wolf-like leaders devour their people through unjust actions, false accusations, and murders. What a clever father. It's a sick joke. That's what it is also. What sane father would teach his rulers a lesson by serving them the flesh of his son? The wolf, or cannibal, is a literary and political metaphor commonly used in Greek literature to describe a ruler's voracity, not veracity, voracity, and savagery. I once believed rulers only devoured us through taxation, inflation, and usury. I now strongly suspect they also devour us physically. The Republic mentions the myth of according to which souls that choose to be tyrants are forced to eat their children as punishment in the afterlife. That is another sick cannibal joke. They, the authors, the world cannibal cult, consider young children a source of valuable, life-enhancing adrenochrome. So they would approve of eating their children in the afterlife because they consider all children their children and not entirely without reason. Another error in the myth of is that children do not deserve to be eaten by anyone. The myth of has precedent or antecedent in the myth of the tyrant Thyestes, who unknowingly ate his children. Yes, Greek literature is littered with cannibal jokes. Plato also briefly mentions cannibalism in his Laws. There he employs it to argue that diet is entirely relative and that food habits vary across time and space, as if to imply that cannibalism could be normal and even moral in some cultures. It's a convenient argument for authors such as Plato, who belonged to the world cannibal cult. Yeah, sure. It's just their culture. Let them have their culture, multicultural relativism. Wonderful stuff. Is this an unpleasant theory? My theory that Plato was one of the cannibals who ruled the world and are, what's the word, casting shadows on our wall, on our minds. Now we are looking away from the shadows cast by Plato on the metaphorical cave wall and looking directly at a glaring, blazing truth. The cannibalism of the authors of Greek literature. They were not against it, absolutely. Plato's ideals, otherwise known as the theory of forms, claims that non-physical abstract ideas are the ultimate unchanging reality from which everything good emanates, and, well, the real world is a corruption of that. How did that happen? They never explain. If you're not already convinced that this is a dangerous lie, let me reveal the mockery encoded in the word ideals. It has its origin in the Dutch and German languages, in which the word for nobleman is edelman. This is not coincidental. European nobles created, I should say, European canny nobles created the English language, and they considered themselves ideals, or in Dutch and German, adels, adels. They are also the idols, as you can verify by observing how much the average person is emotionally invested in religious, political, financial, musical, theatrical, and online digital idols, many of which are secretly noblemen, others are just useful idiots. Plato's cave is the virtual world of false images and false information. This means Plato's books are Plato's caves, for they draw us into an imaginary world full of error and myth, and the myth of error. How is it imaginary? Plato and Socrates, as well as ancient Greece, are all imaginary. How is, well, as I do demonstrate in this book and in some of my online lectures, how is Plato's world full of error? They deceive us about cannibalism, about the ruling class, about wisdom, about democracy, and about nature. Lastly, Plato's books comprise a shadow world because they encourage us to be consumers of ideas. They do not teach us to think and create our own ideas. Instead, they simply feed us ideas so that we remain trapped in the cave of illusions, never able to recognize those illusions and deceptions, and therefore never able to acquire, discover truth, write better books, flourish in nature. Let's think again about how Plato leads us into an anti-nature religion. In the Republic, Socrates argues that the sun is like our eyes because it merely makes the physical world visible. That is a lie. The sun is not a large flying light bulb. The sun is a source of energy as well as a source of warmth. Here, Plato seems to say something positive about the sun. The sun is not only the author of visibility in all visible things, but of generation and nourishment and growth. I wrote that this seems positive because, in fact, it isn't positive within Plato's philosophy, which claims that growth equals becoming and impermanence and does not equal the superior, supposedly unchanging, and eternal forms or ideals. Plato misrepresented the sun in his image of a man struggling up a cliff and being blasted by blazing sun. Is he not likely to be pained and irritated? When he approaches the light, his eyes will be dazzled, and he will not be able to see anything at all of what are now called realities. Well, that seems to contradict the allegory of the cave. That seems to suggest that there's no hope for us at all. We'll just be dazzled too much by truth and blinded by it. Oh well, that's how they look at us. Another question, why did Plato assume that people are not capable of knowing the truth about their world and their lives? Why? Because he did not respect us, and because he wanted us to believe that we need philosopher kings to tell us how to live. The image of a man climbing a cliff toward sunshine implies that the man was in a hole, not on a regular cliff, because normal cliffs do not create full darkness. A cave is a hole, so we're back in the cave. Why is Plato's cave the central image and metaphor in his philosophy? Because he knew about Tartaria, as some call the past iteration of civilization. Sometimes I call Tartaria Tartarus. Plato knew that millions of humans were farmed in underground caves. And he knew when such humans were brought into daylight, their eyes were dazzled. Of course, Plato did not shine any light on this secret dimension of our history. But if he did, perhaps we would understand why now, perhaps 7 generations after our ancestors were brought above ground, we still don't understand nature, and we remain dependent on our masters for everything. Yeah, I've always often reflected on how helpless native people are, so-called native people, but more on that in another lecture. Plato pretended to expose illusions. In the Republic, he argued that we, the working class, are too stupid to lead ourselves. That might be true at present, but as I said, Plato is partly to blame because his job was to maintain or even enhance our ignorance and dependency on the parasitic cannibal class. Secondly, Plato's Socrates could be credited with spreading atheism, but his cave world of shadows and fakery creates weak minds. Weak minds need lies to give them hope so that they can continue surviving as slaves. This tragic state of the world mind will probably continue until people discover something I like to call wisdom and maybe some protocols for achieving mental fitness. What hope is there for that? I don't know. Um, I don't have any hope. I don't need hope. I'm enjoying my mission. I hope you're enjoying the lectures. Um, Doing my best here to be helpful and a little entertaining.